The history of the 19th Amendment and women securing the right to vote in the United States is sometimes confusing. There's so many names and so many organizations and so many other connections to other reform movements that it's sometimes easy to get lost. Hi, I'm Evan Bennett, and I'm Professor of History at Florida Atlantic University and Director of the Voting Rights History Civic Literacy Project. And I'm here with 5 things you should know about the 19th Amendment and the struggle for women's suffrage in America. 1. It took a long time to get to the 19th Amendment. It took a long time for women to get the right to vote in the United States. They'd been denied the right to vote in the colonial era, and in the 19th century, even as male politicians extended the right to vote to increasing numbers of men, they remained resistant to the idea of women voting. The first organized call for women's suffrage came together at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. Support for the idea grew through the 1850s, but the coming of the Civil War quieted many of those calls. In the years after the Civil War, debates over the 14th and 15th Amendments and their defense of black male voting rights divided advocates of women's suffrage. Some who supported the passage of the 15th Amendment created the American Women's Suffrage Association, while those who opposed the passage of the 15th Amendment created the National Women's Suffrage Association. They disagreed not only on the 15th Amendment, but also on the question of tactics for pursuing the right to vote for women in the years after the Civil War. The two organizations came back together in 1890 and formed the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or the NAWSA, and began to pursue a policy of securing the right to vote on a state-by-state level. In the early 20th century, a new generation of activists decided to push again for a constitutional amendment to secure women the right to vote. Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party took an overtly partisan and consciously provocative approach to push President Woodrow Wilson to support a constitutional amendment. Not all suffragists supported the war effort, however, but the much-needed support of some convinced Woodrow Wilson to support the amendment. During World War I, the NAWSA joined the call for a constitutional amendment. They called on President Woodrow Wilson to live up to the ideals he had talked about when he called for a declaration of war and said the United States should make the world safe for democracy. It wasn't until June 4th, 1919, however, that Congress passed the amendment with the necessary 2/3 vote. And it took more than a year for the 3/4 of the states necessary to pass the amendment. On August 26, 1920, Tennessee ratified the 19th Amendment, just in time for the presidential election that year. 2. The 19th Amendment wasn't inevitable. While we might look back from 1920 and assume that the passage of the 19th Amendment was simply the inevitable outflow of history, it's better to understand its passage as the confluence of a number of events at that moment. Supporters of women's suffrage had met resistance for a long time. Some opponents argued that women shouldn't be involved in politics at all. In the years before the Civil War, support for women's suffrage among abolitionists had led many in the South to reject the idea of women's suffrage. During the Civil War and Reconstruction, the questions of the 14th and 15th Amendments had overshadowed the question of women's suffrage. In 1875, the Supreme Court had decided in Minor v. Happersett that women were indeed citizens, but this did not immediately confer on them the right to vote. In the late 19th century, when women's suffrage found support among organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was an organization that wanted to ban alcohol, saloon owners and alcohol manufacturers came together to oppose women's suffrage. Similarly, when cotton mill owners, coal mining operations, and other employers that used child labor found that women were often the most supportive of child labor laws, they too joined together to oppose women's suffrage. While women had some victories at the state level, it wasn't until the early 20th century that a national political party actually endorsed the idea of women's suffrage. In this case, it was the Republicans. And it wasn't until he needed support for American involvement in World War I that Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, was willing to support a constitutional amendment. And even then, as we've seen, it took more than 2 years for Congress and the states to ratify the 19th Amendment. Opposition, in fact, as late as 1920, was still quite strong in many areas, particularly in the South. If it hadn't been for the particular confluence of events that came together in 1919 and 1920, it's not likely the 19th Amendment would have passed. Ultimately, it was the ability of women to convince political leaders of their potential political power that turned them to support the 19th Amendment. 3. All kinds of women and men were involved. Our picture of women's suffrage sometimes focuses exclusively on the elite white women that led national organizations. But securing the right to vote for women took the actions of women across the country, of all backgrounds. Black women were involved in the movement from the beginning. Black women's support for women's suffrage continued even as white women divided over the question of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Well into the 20th century, black women like Mary Church Terrell and the National Association of Colored Women continued to organize to support women's suffrage. Hispanic and Latina women also organized for women's suffrage, particularly in the Southwest and in California. They were joined by immigrant women and their daughters all across the country. And working class women of all sorts of backgrounds came together to support women's suffrage as well. And there were men, too, who supported the cause. While there were many men who were resistant to the idea of women's suffrage, others felt that it was necessary and right for women to have the right to vote. 4. Some women could vote even before the passage of the 19th Amendment. Wyoming was the first state to pass women's suffrage in 1869. Utah followed the next year. In 1893, Colorado voters passed a referendum securing women in that state the right to vote. And in 1896, Idaho amended its constitution. Each of these states extended the right to vote to women because the political leaders of those states felt that women's votes would help them to reach their political goals. The same was true when progressive-era reformers passed women's suffrage laws in other Western states in the early 20th century. Washington in 1910, California in 1911, Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona in 1912, and Nevada and Montana in 1914. Women's votes in these states later proved crucial for passing the 19th Amendment. 5. The passage of the 19th Amendment isn't the end of the story. The 19th Amendment ensured on paper that no one could be denied the right to vote based on sex. And this led to a wide wave of women voting after 1920. But for some women, it was more complicated. Black women in the South, for example, found themselves subject to the same restrictions that had been placed on black men: poll taxes, literacy tests, and sometimes voter registrars who simply would not register them to vote. In the Southwest, Latinas faced many of the same restrictions that had been placed on male Latino voters. And women as voters did not turn out to be quite as revolutionary as many supporters hoped or as many critics feared. In fact, they often voted in much the same pattern as men in their communities. Nevertheless, the presence of women in the American electorate has changed American politics ever since.